Hi guys, today I'm going to show you the proper way to label and store your professional sewing patterns. This is for medium to small fashion design companies, and it can be incredibly helpful. I recently had my meeting with my YouTube members and this topic came up. So I thought I would do a short video explaining the process on how to do this so that you can be professional. Also guys, if you don't know about my YouTube members meetings, I have a small members group that is wonderful, and we meet once a month by Zoom where you get to ask me questions and get support from myself and the group. Check it out in the description box below. All right, let's get started. I'm going to show you what happens after you've made the pattern and all the markings that are put on that pattern, and I'm going to show you two different ways of professionally storing your patterns, your sewing patterns. And so the first thing I'm going to talk about are grain lines. So grain lines on your pattern is probably one of the most important markings or labels that you will have on your pattern. So let me show you on my half scale patterns how to establish that. So here I have a half scale pattern where I have the front bodice, the back bodice, front skirt, back skirt, and straight sleeve. The reason why this is a pattern is because it has seam allowance. This is from the 5-piece sloper set. Step 1, the grain lines. The very first thing you have to do is establish your grain lines. Okay, now there are 3 different grain lines you would normally have, but I'm going to show you all of it on one grain line, but I'll show you the 3 different ones on this first pattern piece just to give you a reminder of what that is. But the grain line is how you design this pattern to be made. So it's not an afterthought. This is not something that you decide to do afterwards and play around with it. This is how you actually either draped the garment or made the pattern, or the pattern existed in this grain line. The first thing is the straight grain line. The straight grain line is usually developed from getting a parallel line to a straight center front or center back of a pattern piece. In this case, this is the front bodice, and I'm going to go ahead and put that line in. I'm making it parallel to that center line. Usually it's about 2 inches over from the center line that you would draw this grain line. Since this is half scale, I'm doing it 1 inch. I'm going to just draw a line parallel almost to the very edge of the pattern piece. This would be considered the lengthwise grain line. The reason why that is because you would be putting it on the length of the fabric itself. Here I have some muslin to show you, a little demonstration. And this is to salvage. This is that tightly woven edge of the fabric that it has. And this is on both ends of the fabric. I'm not going to show you the full width, so just imagine it's here on this end, going lengthwise on the fabric all the way down. And then on the other end of the fabric is also a salvage, from salvage to salvage. So that means I'm putting this pattern piece on the length of the fabric going this way. The cross grain would be the opposite of the lengthwise grain, and that would be perpendicular to that lengthwise grain. So let me just give you a demonstration by putting that there. As soon as I put arrows in like this, it now becomes a grain line. You don't have to write the word grain line on it because it is a universal symbol of a straight line with arrows on the end, meaning that's a grain line. There's also the third grain line, which is the true bias, and that is a 45-degree angle from going into the intersection of 2 points and the center of that line. That becomes the true bias. This is not an exercise in that, but I just wanted you to know that this would be the straight grain. This would be the cross grain, meaning I'm going to use this parallel to the salvage when I cut it. And if I move it to the bias, I'm going to be using this grain line parallel to the salvage to then cut this piece on the bias. Okay, so that's not the exercise that I'm doing, so I just wanted to do a quick demo on that. So the grain line was established on this particular sewing pattern to be lengthwise all throughout. So that's what I'm going to do. So that is the first grain line there. And then I'm going to take another piece, and this is the sleeve. The sleeve sometimes is usually indicated by that center line. It doesn't have to be in the center. It could be a little bit off, but it has to be pretty much the center grain line of where you would put that pattern piece, and most of the pattern piece will be on the true line of that grain line. I have this line already. I'm just going to add the arrows, and now I have the lengthwise grain on my sleeve. The back bodice. Again, I'm going to take the center back. This would be the center back line here, and I'm going to do a parallel line from that center back seam, 1 inch over on a half scale, 2 inches on a full scale. And now I have the grain line there. On the skirt, I see this is the front. This would be the center front of that skirt. I'm going to go ahead and establish that grain line. And I'm going to do the same thing to the back. This would be the center back line. And I'm going to do a 1 inch and normally 2 inches on a full scale parallel line to that center back line, put arrows, and now I've established all the grain lines. Now, there's something to note with this as well. If you see a pattern, or if you're using this pattern with shiny fabric or piled fabric, meaning that the fabric has a one way that it has to it. In other words, it's shiny and that you have to only cut everything the same direction. You will see on these pattern pieces just one arrow. I would take that bottom arrow out and I would just have the line with the arrow on top. So that would indicate that's the top of that pattern piece, and that every pattern piece after that would have to be put on the fabric itself in the same direction, the top of the pattern piece going in one direction. And that indication will be for piled or shiny fabric. Okay, that's grain line. One more thing to note that you'll see on patterns, professional patterns are not ever cut on a fold of fabric like this. They're usually cut open and the pattern piece is large and just cut flat. But sometimes you'll have to spare some space, or you've seen in commercial patterns where there'll be something where it says place on fold. This is the center front, guys, of this pattern piece. So normally if I want to place this on fold with no seam in that center line, I will have to take away that seam allowance like this. And then I would have to make another type of indication, which is, and I'm going to make this about 1/4 of an inch from the center front like this. I would put a parallel line and then another little line towards that folded area with arrows going towards the fold itself. That also is a universal marking that says that this pattern needs to be placed on fold. You would also see them mark it where it would say place on fold, like that. And that means you have to be very careful to cut it on the double like this and put that up against the fold line when you cut it. Okay, we're not going to do the fold on this pattern, so I'm going to open that up just to show you. Step 2, identifying the pattern pieces. Some of these pattern pieces you can see have an identification already on it. It says skirt, back, half scale. Then most of the time you'll also see them on commercial patterns, especially going across like this, nowhere else but across the actual pattern piece. In professional pattern making, everything is pretty much done on top of your grain line and on bottom of your grain line. That way it's easy to identify and you can see what you're doing when you're doing it. So the first thing I'm going to do is identify this pattern piece because it's not identified already, and this is the front bodice. So somewhere on this, because I want to make the other wording in the center of this, I'm going to put towards the very end front bodice, because that is not marked already. This is the sleeve. It is not marked already. I'm going to put on here sleeve. And the other pieces are already marked. That's fine. We'll leave it like that. Now the next step is giving this pattern piece a style number. Now the style number in professional pattern making can be different things. It can be numbers and letters and symbols. It could be an actual name. It could be a season and then a date. It can be many things. A lot of professional fashion design companies will probably identify their patterns or their designs by season or by collection. So you'll see things like spring, summer, or fall, and then a date or an 03 or something like that at the very end. Or you'll just have a very large number and then they just consecutively get larger as you design more and more collections. Also, you can see, and it's not uncommon, to give your pattern a name. It could be, you could call the style number an actual description of what the pattern is. This is a dress sloper pattern, so I could call it that if I wanted to. But I'm going to say that this is spring 04. So what I'm going to do, usually in the midsection of the pattern so it's easily identified, I'm going to give the style number. So the style number will be over to the left here like this, and I'm going to call it spring 24. Like spring 2004, right? And so I'm going to have to put that on every pattern piece on top of my grain line. So on top of my sleeve grain line, I'm going to put SP24, just like that. And then here, the top of that grain line, again, would be SP24. This is considered the top. Now we have to identify the size of this pattern, and that is done also on top of the grain line, either to the right or the left. It really doesn't matter on this one. And I'm going to call this a size 6. So I'm going to put size pretty close to where that style line is. And then I have a 6, and I'm circling that 6 like that. That is to easily identify if the pattern maker or the cutter or the designer, that they know that these pieces are all size 6. So I'm going to go ahead and continue that here as well. Now we have to identify what kind of fabrication this garment will be cut in, or this pattern will be cut in, and how many times of each of the fabrics are going to be cut out. And that is all done underneath the grain line, one by one. So the first thing I'm going to put here on the first pattern piece, because I always like to start with the main pattern piece. And the main pattern piece would be the front of a dress or front of a blouse or the front top half of a garment. And that's what I have here. So now underneath there, in between these two markings here, I'm going to write, because this is going to be cut twice, we're not putting it on fold, I'm going to put 2, circle that, and then put self. Self is a universal word that means the main fabric that you're actually making this garment in. And usually that's established beforehand, or if you have several different types of fabric that you can make this actual pattern in, you might also want to then put in parentheses specifically what that self is going to be. Let's say it's cotton print. In parentheses, I'll put there for the main fabric. And you're going to continue doing that to all the pattern pieces underneath these two markings. So this is going to need 2 as well, because you need both the right and the left side of the skirt. So we're going to put 2 self, and we're going to call it cotton print. And I'm going to put that in parentheses like that. I'm going to do that to all the pattern pieces here as well. This is 2 as well, self, cotton, print. Okay, let's say that your pattern actually has lining to it and interfacing to it. All of those indications have to then be one by one listed underneath where the main fabric is. So in other words, if this is, let's say this is lined by chance, I'm going to have to put 2, circle that, and I'm going to identify the type of lining it is. I'm going to say it's cotton lining. And let's say the bodice is lined. So that means I'm going to look for the back bodice as well, because the entire bodice is lined. And I'm going to say 2. Okay, the camera shut off and I wasn't able to complete, but what I did write is 2 cotton lining, and then after that are the interfacing. So your main fabric is here, your lining is underneath, and then any kind of interfacing or backing or anything like that will be underneath. I wanted to show you one more thing before I went to the next part, which is if you have an asymmetrical design. Let's say I have this bodice here and I have this asymmetrical design that goes like this, and I cut it out. And let's say that there's little notches here, and this is the top part of the bodice and this is the bottom part of the bodice. You have to make sure when you're cutting this piece and you put the markings, let's say this is the center line here, so I'm going to go ahead and put the grain line 1 inch from that center line like this. And then I'm going to have to write on this somewhere on the pattern so that they don't make a mistake, right side up. And that means that when the cutter is using this pattern to cut out of the fabric, they don't turn it this way and they don't turn it this way, that it only goes in this direction or this side up, because that has to be cut that way in order for it to fit the asymmetrical design. So underneath I would put 1 self like that in whatever the actual fabric is, and on the bottom one I would put 1 self. Now sometimes this is enough for a small company, and you can even write all the other information that you would want to on the pattern itself. But if you're a little bit larger and you have, let's say, a separate cutter, or you have a separate pattern maker, or it's going to be sent out to be cut somewhere, you're going to want something that's called a pattern record card or a cutter's must. And let me show you how to fill that out. Here is a simple pattern record card, and it is something that you can adjust to your liking. It has basic columns. Here in the middle section, you have the pattern pieces that you're going to be actually cutting out, and you're going to list them here. Over here is the number of pieces. So if there's one piece or two pieces that are available for the cutter. And then here is how many times you're cutting that pattern piece out to make that garment. Then over here, you've got the style number. You add your style number. You have size ranges. Let's say that is only a sample garment and you only made it in a size 6 first. You can write size 6, but then when you're actually producing it, you can then add all the sizes that you've made that pattern for. Yardage, how many yards it takes, and the width of the fabric itself. The date that you finished your pattern. It's very important for any adjustments that are being made. And then it's nice to have a quick front and back sketch of the garment itself. All right, so then when you're filling it out, as you can see here, like I started with the first piece, I wrote one front bodice. That's because it's only one piece that I have available, and it is called the front bodice, but it will be cut 2 times in self. So you want to write there 2 in the self, in the cutting section, and you keep going with that. You list the back bodice and the skirt and the sleeve. Once you get to the linings and the interfacings, you can then just either put a thick line or a line in the actual area of where you stopped listing the self fabric, and then start listing the linings, and then so forth and so on. Make another line across, and then your interfacings, etc. Some companies will maybe color code it and put it in like red or blue or whatever. I don't find it totally necessary unless you have a large company and they have special guidelines that they want you to keep. So this is the pattern record card. These are the pieces. Let's get to the storing section. So storing your professional patterns, the best way is to have something that's called a rabbet. This is this large die-cast piece of equipment that is quite heavy, and it makes a perfect little circle, or cuts out a perfect circle there, as you can see, when it is pushed down. It also has a little guide here with a screw so that you can have a stopper, so to speak, of how far you can put your pattern pieces so that everything is consistently stamped in the same location. So this thing that's called a rabbet is very useful in order to make a perfect hole to hang up your patterns with what is called a pattern hook here. This is a pattern hook that has a cord and a nice hook on one side, and then this end is where you're actually pushing into the pattern or the hole. So let me show you how to do that first. I like to put, most of the pattern pieces together, and I also like to make sure that I kind of stay away from any major markings or too much taking apart a dart. In other words, I wouldn't put the hole right here. I would probably put the hole here. So I'm going to line up the hole this way. I may turn my pattern piece this way on the back so that when I put the hole, it's not affecting that as well, and so forth. I'm going to probably put the bottom of the skirt this way like that, so I'm not really affecting any part of the design like that. And I'm going to do the same thing with the sleeve itself, like this. Now you take your rabbet like this, and you fit it underneath. You can put several layers of this on there. After you hit where that guide is here, and you have a nice location in most of your pattern pieces together, you can then press down and get a perfect hole, just like that. Once you have that perfect hole, you get your pattern hook like this, and you place it through the hole so that it will also lock itself in the back, and that's how you're able to hang your patterns if you're hanging them up professionally. So most of my patterns when I was in my sample room or I had my design room were hung up like this on a large bar where there were windows. And that can be a little tricky, guys, because after a while the heat actually damaged some of my patterns. So then I had plan B, which I'll show you. But I still, to this day, when it's a very important pattern, if it's a sloper or a basic pattern that I know I'm going to use quite a bit, I will keep them, especially if they're made out of oak tag, which is this hard cardboard. You really can't fold these up and you really can't store them any other way. So they're best to be hung up always. But if you have a lot of patterns and you're archiving them as well, you might want to do the second thing, which is also universally done, even in design houses that are a little bit smaller in nature. And that is with large envelopes, as you can see here. This envelope is approximately 12 by 15.5. And this is about the size that I like to use. And the one wonderful thing about this is that it gives me the opportunity to keep my patterns safe and to have them sometimes maybe even in the garage or in a closet, and they're still safe. What I like to do is put the design or the picture on the front of the envelope itself. And I like to have quick recognition of certain things when I'm going to hunt for my patterns, which is, as you can see here, I literally have the year that it was designed in, the size range very quickly on there, and I even have the fabrication on there as well. That way when I'm flipping through my envelope, I also have usually a second sketch with a hole in it so I can hang the pattern up at any time, the original design photo, all the pattern pieces, and a pattern hook available inside so that I can always just switch it up and change it that way for hanging or storage. So that's how I do it, and that's the way I've done this in the industry for other design companies, and I hope this helps you. Give me a comment and let me know your strategy for making your patterns and marking your patterns and storing your patterns. Share that below so others can join in the conversation. See you next time. Bye-bye.